Shabit 4 had been settled for a few hundred years so far. It was mostly an agricultural planet, which prided itself on the largest agricultural university in the quadrant. Species would come from all over to learn better ways to farm, from cropping techniques to maintenance of the equipment. The human class of about 50 students had been on planet for the last 2 years. They had grown rather fond of the teachers and other students, and had learned new methods of growing crops which would be useful back home and on the colony planets. The humans had been received with a bit of trepidation at first, what with their coming from a Class 4 death world. Several other students had suggested that the humans must have to fight against man-eating plants, continent-wide dust storms, and plagues of crop-eating insects, which would cover the sun when in flight. The first human to hear about these ideas had smiled. Yeah, all true, except the man-eating plants are too small to eat you, they just eat insects. The alien student mentioned the dust storms and plagues of insects. Not as bad as it used to be, but give us a long enough drought and the dust can be blown up pretty well back home. Luckily, the Galfed tech we have been given access to has allowed us to reduce the plague insects before they become a problem. Mind you, this means we are out in the sunlight a lot more. After the first 2 years, everyone was getting along well. The cross-pollination of ideas was happening exactly like the university founders had hoped it would. A good example of this was when a newly arrived group of students from Nove 6 mentioned an issue with a plague-level rodent animal on one of their orbital island farms. The humans lent them a group of cats, who would have the problem under control in a few weeks. The cats did the job so well, they were given Novian citizenship, and a request was made to allow them to stay and breed. The decision by the Accu raiders to target the system was odd. The planet was not rich in material goods, such as gold or other metals, and the funds managed by the university were all stored in Galfed-protected accounts. The accounts could not be opened by someone under duress in any circumstances. The only resources they had were various food crops, and some ornamental plants grown by the students for a bit of weekend spending money. It turned out that the Accu raiders were not part of the Galactic Federation, so they decreed the planet Shabit 4 their territory, and ignored all the Planetary Council's messages about the Galfed rules for things like this. Being an agricultural planet, there was no standing army, no defense systems, and nothing the Council could think of to stop the invasion. The Accu had odd methods of attacking planets. First, they declared their ownership. They would strike any opposition army from orbit. Then they just land and start talking what they wanted. A Galfed study team would later determine that this was based on how they did things in their sector, where they had evolved into space faster than their neighbours, and had immediately gone about invading anything they could breathe on. The lack of a standing army to be targeted from orbit had made them skip the entire attack stage of the plan, and had gone straight to the occupy bit. The first time an Accu patrol had turned up at the mechanical campus, they had just walked in, started rifling through spare parts bins and student lockers, and taking anything that caught their eyes. It was not that they ignored the students and teachers, more than they did not consider them a threat of any kind. The later Galfed study of the Accu race would discover that the race was divided into several classes, one of which was the fighters. Members of any other class on their worlds would not respond to violence or attack in any way whatsoever. The fighters, though, would respond. It seemed that the Accu commanders believed the entire planet was occupied by worker-class beings, so there was no danger of retaliation. Some of the few surviving Accu command staff would still not understand what happened to them, even after being shown the footage. The idea that fighters could also be workers was akin to saying up was left, and hot was a small potted plant. The one thing the Accu had made sure of when they invaded was to shut down all off-planet comms. No message had got out about the invasion, so no help would be coming anytime soon. The students and locals may have just ignored the Accu as a minor pest, except that they had the annoying habit of stealing things which caught their attention. From refined metals or plastic, to all the blue-coloured tables from the university cafeteria. Unfortunately, seen as the main colour of the uni was blue, this meant all of the tables were taken. Attempts to stop them resulted in the Accu present just swatting the student or local out of the way. The power-armoured suits they were wearing tended to make this a rather fatal encounter. After a few weeks of the random ransacking and general theft by the Accu, the leader of the human mechanical class approached the Chancellor of the university. "Chancellor, we may have a solution to the Accu issue, but would like to know who to ask for permission." Chancellor Hattad had been in the job for about 40 local years so far, and this was the worst thing he had ever found in the records as happening to the university. Any solution was worth listening to. "Lead Mechanic Giles, what do you suggest?" Giles was a mechanic who loved his farm machines almost as much as he loved his human history. Hailing from a small farm on the southern portion of his homeworld, his family had been farming there for over a dozen of their generations. The small group of mechanics who had accompanied him to the uni were there to study farming machinery from other races, and see what they could do to improve their own designs. As was custom, they had brought some of their own machines along with them, and had been actively enjoying the looks on the other students' faces when they described where these machines had come from. As was known to many races around the Galfed sphere, the humans came from a Class 4 Death World, a planet so dangerous it would automatically not be listed in any colonization or travel databases, and any sentient who landed there would be offered rescue, as soon as it was safe to do so. The machines the humans had brought with them were all listed as surplus AFVs, decommissioned. It seemed that the human armed forces would not recycle their old fighting vehicles, instead offering them to farmers as cheap alternatives to civilian farming equipment. This tradition seemed to have been going on for generations, right back to one of their early major wars where surplus battle tanks were sold to farmers to use as tractors. These tanks were hastily made safe before being sold for scrap value to the farmers. Giles and his crew had brought along 6 of their customized farm vehicles. These former tanks are seen combat as part of the Terran military response to several raids by pirates or foolish alien races who believed the humans would be easy pickings. They were previously all painted in very bright civilian colours to make them easy to be seen while working, and had several flashing lights to alert people to their approach. Chancellor Hattad had seen them being offloaded, and had not realised what they were until Mr. Giles had told him. "And you have spent the last 2 weeks doing what to them?" The mechanics have been busy. While the former tanks were all made safe, the humans had learned a long time ago that a sleeping tank can be woken up when needed. The spares container, which had been dropped at the same time as the tanks themselves, actually contained all the weapons and lockouts to make these tanks fully functional again. The Accu raiding parties had ignored the boring-looking container, as it had farm surplus written on the side. The engineers had been busy, and the 6 tractors had been returned to full fighting specs. Chancellor Hattad was amazed at what had been achieved in such a short time. "They look good, but will they be enough to repel the Accu?" Retired tank commander, now turned farm engineer Mr. Giles, smiled. "Chancellor, these tanks have the best stealth and energy weapons available at the time they were decommissioned. The AI inside them, their armour and their defensive weapons, made them almost impervious to the technology displayed so far by the Accu, and we can be at their landing spot in under a few days. It is unlikely they will see us coming until it is too late. We will cripple their ships, and once they are planet-bound, suggest to them they surrender if they ever want to see home again." 4 days later, the remaining Accu commanders surrendered to the tank forces. They could still not understand where the fighter-class soldiers had come from, nor how the armoured death they rode to victory had made it to the planet undetected. With communications restored and a Terran Marine force as part of the response, the Accu were escorted back to their home sector, and taught what being a spacefaring race in the current Galfed environment meant. Several conquered worlds were liberated, and the Accu sentenced to 20 generations of planet-bound re-education. Meanwhile, the 6 AFVs had been disarmed back to farming standard and repainted to their colourful safety skins. This time, though, several of them had the black silhouettes of Accu dropships painted just beside the cabin doors. The AIs on each tractor had also put several higher functioning modules back to sleep mode, so they could better concentrate on their important farming tasks. While not quite bolos, they do well enough in a pinch. Chancellor Hattad looked at the tractors going back to the fields, demonstrating how they ploughed a human field, and then looked at Mr. Giles. "What is a bolo?"